All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our latest webinar from FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call. Today we are talking about the state of public affairs for 2020, and we're going to examine some best practices. So obviously that's a large and sweeping topic, and we're going to have some tips and tricks from the pros here to make this hopefully your best year ever. I am Anne Dermody. I'm the Content Marketing Director here at FiscalNote and CQ. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So first of all, this whole webinar is based around a survey that we did recently, very recently, where we asked 600 public affairs, well, we asked actually a lot more than 600, but 600 public affairs and government relations, public policy, corporate and external affairs, and grassroots and advocacy pros around the country responded to this survey that we sent out. And it represented pretty much every industry in the global economy at this stage. So we had respondents from companies on the Fortune 500 list, from the largest trade associations and nonprofits and lobbying and law firms, all the way down to very small nonprofits. And pretty much every industry was included: healthcare, tech, education, manufacturing, oil and gas, and of course the public sector. We asked 38 different questions. And the folks who responded worked in organizations with everything from less than 5 people all the way up to several multinationals with over 1,000 employees. So pretty broad scope across the whole public affairs and government relations industry. And as you might imagine, respondents had a lot of opinions, and the results were pretty fascinating, I think, and sometimes surprising. And we asked everything from things like what's bothering you in your jobs, what's working well for you, what you think the future of your organization or your vision for the future of your industry is like, and what your kind of working life would be like in the near future. I'd encourage everyone, obviously, to download the report. It's a free report, and we will send the link in a follow-up email. We'll also send the recording to this webinar. So you can look out for that in the next day or so. But apart from me, we have two great experts, two practitioners in the field here. First of all, we'll hear from Joshua Habursky. Josh is the head of federal affairs at the Premium Cigar Association. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, and he's also a contributing editor at Campaigns and Elections. Josh is on the line, and I'm joined here in person in the studio by Karl Eckhart. Karl serves as the Vice President of Intergovernmental Affairs at the National Association of Home Builders. He previously worked at the National Association of Realtors, which means he has over a decade of experience in housing advocacy. And in 2011, he published a campaign guide titled 50% Plus One, The Fundamentals of Running a Successful Grassroots Campaign. So first of all, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I think are some of the highlights in the report. And before we get to that, I'll just tell you that on your screen, you should be able to see a chat box and a question and answers box. If you have some questions, please do put them in. You can put them in all the way throughout the presentation, but we'll probably get to them at the end. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully I'll remember to remind you a little later in the presentation anyway. So some highlights. I think one of the first things we did notice was that government affairs and public affairs, and maybe this isn't too shocking to anyone, seems to be a pretty traditional profession. 25% of our respondents were C-suite or senior VP level. So, folks who've probably been in their careers for quite a while. 22% of those respondents were 65 plus. So that's kind of an interesting, I think, factor that almost a fifth or more than a fifth of you are in that age group. This was also interesting given kind of that I was just recently reading that millennials and Gen Z, I think, favor working remotely and flexibility over all else in their working lives. But in the government affairs and public relations or public affairs world, it seems that only 13% of you, according to our survey, work remotely. 37% have been at their organization for 10 plus years. So a lot of longevity there. 68% said that their primary degree was related to their job. So it sounds like you were pretty focused on what you wanted to do from day one. And half of you always intended to work in government relations. So what are your challenges? Well, by far the greatest one, I think it was over 50%. You said that your biggest challenge was a lack of time. So no real surprise there. And I don't know that that's specific to the industry. Again, a large portion of you said that regulations is the biggest impact on your industry, followed by a divided Congress and social media. I'd call attention to the social media because even though you see it as having a huge impact, it's kind of interesting what you say a little later on. A third say they are following 10 plus issues. And if we skip the next point and go to the 71% who say that the number of issues they need to track has increased since they joined the organization, it would seem that given that we saw on the previous slide that, you know, folks are in their organization for a long time, you've had a good chance to kind of observe that. So it seems pretty obvious across the board that the number of issues needed to be tracked has increased significantly. Building relationships, still very, very important for everybody in the government relations and public affairs space. You said that building relationships with lawmakers and staffers is your number one and number two relationship building goal. So no surprises there. And then 80% of you, kind of along the same lines, said that working with external stakeholders is critical to your success. The tools you depended on, this is kind of good news for us, obviously, here at FiscalNote and CQ. News subscriptions, legislative trackers, industry associations in that order were your number one tools. You also said that policy news was the number one source of information for you, followed by official government documents. And here's where it's kind of interesting. So although I think it was over 40% said that social media was a big challenge for you, when it comes to a source for you, it's way, way down the list. So you might be stressing about it, but you're not paying attention to it from a news source perspective. So what does the policy of the future look like for you? Well, a little over half of you said that you felt that the federal government would have a stronger influence on your industry in the near future. 60% thought that state legislation or regulations would have a bigger effect on their industry in the near future. And while right now only 11% of you concentrate on international policy, almost 3 times as many of you, 30%, feel that international regulations and legislation are going to have a bigger impact on your industry in the next few years. And I suppose if we look at GDPR in the EU and how that's creeping into some of the states and into the bigger picture here, that all makes sense. So, turns out you're very stressed out. 68% of you said your job was stressful or very stressful and you expect it to become even more challenging in the next few years. And some of the reasons for those stressors are time constraints, political landscape, a lack of resources in your department, and of course that perennial, I think, that exists for everybody in the government relations and public affairs space, that fear of missing something, some important issue in relation to your organization or industry. Another thing that's eating up your time is having to create briefs and reports, and 37% say they have to do that daily or weekly, and pretty much the rest all say they have to do it at least monthly or quarterly. So that's eating up a lot of time, obviously. And so that's kind of our brief overview of the report. Again, we'll send the link in the follow-up email to the along with the recording. So, you know, don't let that be a stress. You're going to get the report as well following this, as long as you've registered for the webinar. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh. So over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you to FiscalNote and CQ for putting together a comprehensive report like this. It truly is that subtitle of the report, the 2020 State of the Industry, and that information and anecdotes are really important One of the things that I wanted to do in this presentation is to go through some of the high-level data points and a few of the ones that Ann mentioned in the introduction, and provide a little context to them as a practitioner, and an explanation of, how did we get to the current state of public affairs and government relations, and knowing the sentiments and the feelings that are being expressed in this report and by people in the field. So, I think by and large, everyone is expected to do more with less, to do more and more exhaustive and expansive activities with less resources, a lot of times less personnel. That is the expectation of modern government relations. It is working harder and also having to work smarter to assess all the factors and variables at play. I thought it was really interesting to see that 2/3 of teams have less than 6 people. And this stat really jumped out at me because a lot of government relations and public affairs is moving from in-house positions to having a variety of different consultants and expertise in certain issue areas. People that used to be generalists that would have government relations in their total portfolio. You still have leadership positions that control that, but you have people that are focused to solely digital advocacy, focused to field organizing. The proliferation of the career fields in overall government relations and advocacy has expanded and has become more specialized, and thus you see less in-house and more of a reliance on those that are outside vendors and consultants. And I think, by and large, that that can be, there's positives and negatives with that development. PAC, grassroots, direct lobbying, crisis communications, executive, federal, state, local, international, it's all encompassing. There's that interconnectivity with the C-suite, interconnectivity with other communications and marketing functions, and the overlap and the expectation of government relations feeding those other outlets of the organization for content, for metrics, for those reports, so that the importance of overall government relations activity has increased within any given organization. Half report directly to the C-suite. Again, that's another stat from this report that emphasizes the importance of government relations. You have very high-level people in associations and corporations that have the expectations of government relations work and are seeing that these new trends develop. Advanced education is required, increased stress and demands. I think that those in-house jobs, although that teams are smaller and there's less availability for them, they're significantly sought after roles where you truly, on the record, have the ability to represent an industry at large. Go to the next slide. So the impact in looking at the federal and state legislative and regulatory and legal, again, talking of very, very broadly that this is all-encompassing, the demands and the expectations that at the federal and the state level, the increased focus over the next few years and the dependency of organizations on government relations, I think it's a given impact of a lot of the stats and the anecdotes that are confirmed in this report. The other impact of the modern state of public affairs and government relations is if you're running a department, if you're the head of federal affairs, the head of advocacy, you are responsible for, 3 core functions, or at least administering 3 core functions, legislative, regulatory, and legal. The courts, you're seeing an increased participation in the overall process on the back end with the judicial system and the court challenges and litigation. I think advocacy encompasses all three of those: legislative, regulatory, and legal. So, the stats that Ann mentioned, 33% following 10-plus issues, whereas 5-10 years ago, you may be working on 2 or 3 given pieces of legislation at the federal level, or, working through the appropriations process. Now it's significantly multifaceted. If you are an association professional, you may be involved in 10 different committees, let alone 10 different issue areas. And your portfolio may represent a wide variety of diverse issues. Working for the Premium Cigar Association, I can cite the first-hand example that, we're working on tobacco regulation overall, but we've gotten into things like payment processing, credit card transactions. We represent the retail members. So what are the pain points and the issues that are involved from the retail side as well as the traditional tobacco control side of things? And this, you see, it is happening throughout the different jurisdictions of government. So it's not just one area that you have to worry about. 71% say that there's an increase in your expectations, and the big challenge is a lack of time. And looking at the expectations of a modern public affairs and government relations professional, the data is certainly consistent with that. The reporting mechanisms definitely are time-consuming. Providing updates to key stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement, I would, equate to another representation for why these facts hold true. The time that it takes to update your board members, to update coordinate organizations, if you're part of a coalition, just explaining the complexity of these issues. Looking at the spending bills in the end of the year budget process, not only do you have, one issue that you're tracking within that, it's explaining all of the different parts and how the political process is shaping. And as advocacy increases and as more grassroots and grass top stakeholders take part in it, the more you have to do as head of government relations or government relations professional to explain that process. I talked 5 years ago when we first started doing these webinars about how a grassroots professional, it was necessary to be part civics teacher and teach Civics 101. I would like to, reaffirm that statement, but the goalposts have moved, and now we're, required to teach Civics 201 and 301, more advanced learning in the sphere, because the engagement is increasing by those members alongside overall government relations engagement. Technology is allowing for increased productivity. It's not all doom and gloom. We do have some hope about relieving some of that stress. I think that the legislative tracking, the tools and the reports, the media digest, the curation of information is going to be increasingly as important. Technology definitely needs to stay up to date with that. I think that the reliance on social media and that stat being low about the trustworthiness of that certainly comes into play, and I would expect in the future, there'll be more social media aggregation tools for advocacy and different updates of what the expectations are. The software technology platforms and social media platforms are updating so frequently that another time-consuming activity is just staying informed on what tools are out there. I know any given grassroots and advocacy professional, if you look and did an assessment of them, whether they were maximizing the effectiveness and the use of their tools that they have at hand, whether it's free or paid service, there's a lot of gaps in there in use. So as we close the gaps, I think that it becomes a sense where the technology and the productivity are able to negate one another in terms of that time consuming. More information is causing intensive research. You can, that statement holds true across the board. Whether it's learning to use these tools, whether it's messaging to key stakeholders, engaging with elected officials, you have to do more research and have more preparation take place before you can actually get something across the finish line. We've talked about this in previous webinars about the approval process and getting something, across the finish line. I think for those of you that are in the small associations with less than 6 government relations professionals, sometimes we have the headaches. Oh, this is taking too long to get done. Why isn't this out the door? I think that in that bucket, we're very fortunate. It may seem frustrating at first glance, but the larger associations and the corporations, the requisite research that they have to do is 5-10-fold for what we have, and that definitely contributes to the stress and the lack of time that they have to actually working on the messaging and delivery of these government relations services. So, growing interest in hiring policy experts, I think that this is an important stat and one that I can speak to even individually from the Premium Cigar Association. We require and need a lot of assistance in getting the complex health policy, tobacco regulation policy together. And it's one where, we're seeking assistance from legal-minded folks that have a writing and briefing capability. Your vice presidents of government relations, your C-suite, where we work in vice president and above level, typically we're communicating a lot of this, but, for most of us, we're not in the weeds in all of the inner workings of policy. We rely on these experts to provide, the Cliff Notes version or the abbreviated version of that. Much like an agency or department that works in the federal government, you have your directors and, your appointed staff that must communicate this to the different stakeholders, but it requires people to provide the research and the other functions that I previously mentioned that are taking time. So that growing interest, if we're able as an industry to get more folks hired in as policy experts, that will allow the reduction in the research, intense research capabilities that are required for the C-suite and the executive level folks in government relations. So, we went over this stat, but multiple battles are, 68% are stress or more stress. I think it goes into play the interconnectivity of business, industry, and government. When your bottom line as a corporation or an association is affected by regulation, affected by legislation, you have a lot of pressure to deliver as a government relations professional. Karl and I both, I assume get calls frequently from members that they hear something in the news that involves their industry and that they're concerned about and want to know what is the association doing. And being able to respond in real time quickly to those member inquiries that affect bottom lines, that affect businesses, that affect small business jobs in local communities is important. Legislation and regulation definitely affect bottom lines of industry across the board. So we are seeing multiple battles in different frontiers. Having a lack of legislative activity has put increased emphasis on the legal and regulatory fronts. There's an increased cost of conducting effective government relations. We talked about all of the different components, all the different technologies that are in play. That is another real world norm that we have to operate in. I also see a lot of the proliferation of policy at the state and local level that definitely gets kicked up. I would not, I think the one report statistic, and I agree with the respondents' line of thinking, and I think it will only increase over the next few years, is the international influence in policy. We're seeing that in a variety of different issue areas, but the World Health Organization, things in that sphere, it's definitely something that I have to monitor. I might not be engaging and responding and writing on that currently, but that's something that is definitely on the horizon. And then, finally, how can government relations staff embrace the future? Of course, embrace technology and the change that comes with it. Maximize, work with your account representatives. Do a check-in call. Reach out to your rep at FiscalNote or in CQ and say, hey, what are the new developments? Through series like this, I know you get a lot of the latest and greatest in the policy white papers, but having a quick 10, 15-minute check-in really helps a lot in getting the latest of what's going on. I will frequently do that and, ask the question, what is the next development that the company is working on? What do I need to prepare for as a professional? Actively monitor tactical trends. Again, these are great resources that we're bringing to you through the webinar series and other vehicles. I do a bi-weekly newsletter for campaigns and elections on advocacy technology. I know that FiscalNote and CQ will have representation at our big advocacy technology conference to get those latest trends. Of course, monitoring the news and giving special attention to local and state clusters of policy. If you have 3 or 4 states percolating a new policy initiative, it's definitely that's something that needs to go on your radar. Analyze successful campaigns and organizations, looking at peer-to-peer. I've said before, and I was excited when Karl was announced as the guest for this webinar. The National Association of Home Builders has been a leader at the forefront of advocacy for many years, and my good friend, previously in the director of grassroots role, we would frequently communicate successful campaigns that were going on in individual associations where we were at, and see if there were tactics or ways that we could be replicated within our overall organizations. Peer-to-peer engagement and information sharing will help reduce that stress and that workload of individual practitioners. Leverage your full set of tools to reduce the burdens of personnel. I think, reporting in that check-in call that you have with your reps, I would say, I'm expected to do this report. What metrics can we automate, or how can we easily, streamline a report so it's effective for me to, share with the stakeholders that I need to on a daily, weekly basis, or whatever interval of time that you have to provide. And also, finally, set realistic expectations and goals for the C-suite. Again, we shared a lot of information. There's a lot more information in this report. One of the things that you can't overburden yourself. A lot of times when you're in an organization or you join an organization, you come with your own set of goals and expectations, and they might not necessarily match the organization from the onset. So working with your leadership and member leadership, as well as the executive, to develop your overall expectations for government relations will help keep things in check and create those guideposts for you, so you don't have to overly inundate yourself with information and projects that really don't come to fruition or produce the intended results that are necessary for you to succeed. now turn it over to Karl.
Great. Thanks, Josh. It's Anne here again. Some great tips and tricks there, and we will come back to some of those, I think, at the end when we get to questions. Again, to the folks listening, please do put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end. But in the meantime, we're going to go over to Karl.
All right. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Josh. Thank you, FiscalNote. I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 of the items that sort of popped out to me in the survey. The first one is education, and a lot of us have that political science degree because we either couldn't decide what to do when we got to college, or maybe that was our goal. But I think even with the high percentage of folks in the survey who wanted the profession in government affairs, I don't think anybody in the survey told their high school guidance counselor they wanted to lobby for tire manufacturing tax credits or even housing. But here we are, and I think that it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that our profession is a very nebulous one. You can get here from all angles. And the political science degree itself is fine, but the science part maybe skips a little bit gently past science. But I think in my experience, 2 things have held true. One is that birds of a feather flock together, and that people vote to feel better, but not always to live better. And I think in the political world that we have to operate in, I think those 2 things can help kind of navigate, why we got where we are and where we're going. I've learned those a lot from political campaigns. I've worked on everything from literally dog catcher to presidential, volunteer on the presidential side, but been able to work at all levels. And I think that that's a big benefit when it comes to being a government relations professional. And I would encourage everybody to hop out if you can and go volunteer for a longer period, or go work on a campaign. If you're just starting out in your career, take a break and go work. And win or lose, it doesn't matter. It's just that you have to go out there in the middle of nowhere and knock on doors and convince somebody to vote for somebody. And that's the hardest sell you're ever going to make. I think if you can spend time in, I'm from Iowa, so no sending in Iowa questions, but just that's where I'm from, and I'm sorry for the caucus. But you can go out there and spend time talking to real voters and convince them to vote for somebody. You can do anything. And so I think that's in D.C., I know a lot of the survey respondents said they had a law degree or a PhD or a master's degree, and that's very important to have that. But I think it's also important to, as you're hiring people or you're trying to fill your small team, keep that street smart person in mind. At the Home Builders, we promote the trades, and I think that politics is a trade in a way, and I think that you can get someone in there, and with the smaller teams that we all have in our offices, and that's not going to change, having the generalist who you can teach the vocabulary to is maybe more important than having the PhD in some specific bit of knowledge. Now, if you're working for a big corporation, you have to have those geniuses in there. But as far as getting out there, I first started in the housing world about 10 years ago, and I didn't know a impact fee from anything else in housing. And now I can speak to a legislator for about 10 minutes and sound smart. And I think that's something that you can teach people to do and advocate for your industry or your business. The other thing that popped out during the survey was how we're all doing way more than we were years ago or even last year. At the Home Builders, we do the state and local is the same department that does a lot of our political work. And so the election year is twice as busy because you've got state legislatures and local levels who are in business. And then also we have to worry about supporting our federal friends and our state and local friends. So I get it, and I know that this is the hard time for all of us. I think it's 30%, so they're doing more than they were 10 years ago. I think that's probably closer to 90 if we were all really honest. And who sets the agenda has really popped out in there. the industry you're in, that sets the agenda. Your opponents often set the agenda. For us, it's the members of our association are a huge factor. We're a member-driven group, and so if some item or issue is affecting a large enough number of our members, then we all shift to that, and then you have to shift back to the other 10 things you were doing. So it's ongoing run of patience and being flexible. I think in government affairs, we're in customer service, basically, but we don't make anything. And so I think if you can keep that in mind, that your job in the government affairs is to, serve whatever that customer is, be it your industry or your members or even your own lobbying firm. That's important. And if you get the great opportunity to do a proactive piece of legislation and pass it, please call us back and tell us how you did it, because that sounds like a great goal. Our budgets are shrinking, our team size is shrinking, and then we all want to use technology. I think that's like one of our internal battles everywhere. There's not going to be any more money. Those on the top of the decision train have already said that for most of us, and I think it's important. As much as I love all the technology, it's okay to maybe hyper focus your use of it, and be maybe even more effective, or go low tech and just call people. That with our grassroots, we do a lot just by telephone. But I think with a low investment and the focusing that technology allows, you can have a huge impact. Give you an example. Last year, one of our big issues was the price of lumber, which is used to build homes. It was very high due to tariffs and all kinds of other issues, and so we ran videos that were only seen at the addresses of the lumber companies. And so everybody who worked in those lumber companies turned on their computers and they saw these ads calling them all kinds of names. And we'd love to take credit for it fixing the problem. It probably didn't, but it was one of the things we did to show our members value and show that we can play at a bigger level than we were. We seemed like we were having a much more bigger impact than we probably really did, but it got noticed, and that's the important thing. That's where I think technology can be your friend, even if you've got a shrinking budgets and teams. So add in the election work, and it gets even worse. But I think I'd like to encourage you to really focus on that this year and to make next year easier. I've been in this game for about 25 years, and I think the thing I've learned and seen proven true is if you help elect them, it's really easy to lobby them. And it can even be you help elect them, and then you can become their advisor or their educator instead of just a lobbyist. So I'd encourage you between now and the election to get out there and knock on doors and help a campaign or two. But don't be that D.C. jerk that shows up on election weekend. Go there in September. That'll make a huge difference. That's when they notice you're there, and that's where you actually have an impact. So take a week, take Labor Day week, take a week in September and go help 2 or 3 members of Congress or some state legislature where you're having issues, and that will make your job monumentally easier when it comes back time for them to be in session. The last part would be the grassroots. I work at the state level, and I like that a lot better. But I think that the grassroots at the federal and the state is probably the most important tool in our lobbying toolbox. The survey showed that lawmakers are the number one target for those of us who took that survey. I'd like to have you think about it the reverse way, that lawmakers are our number one target, but the lawmaker's number one target is not the lobbyist. It's those who vote them in. And so if you can bring those who vote them in and show them how important they are, that's going to help you to put your message out there. And I think that's why the grassroots is the best lobbying tool that we have. Now, finding those grassroots people is the hard part. You've got to pick up the phone. You've got to go out there to Poughkeepsie, New York, and find them and train them and get them ready to talk to the legislator. But that will make a lasting impact with those politicians, much more than a pack check and a fancy dinner. So I think use that that tool more and more. I think you'll get more benefit from it, and it will show in your budgets that you spent $1,000 to put that meeting together back home for the member of Congress or the state legislator, but it paid off because you got that bill passed. Again, the state level is that's where the action is as the survey showed and Josh mentioned. And I think that means you've got to really listen to what's going on back in the states. But it's doable, and I think that if we can stop some of these bad ideas, in our industry we joke that all bad ideas start in California and move east, but now it's really they start everywhere, California, Kansas, and in New York. So it's where the action is, so it's important to get out there. So that's what I've got, and I'm happy to take questions. Again, thank you for the time.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Karl. Again, to anybody listening, now's a good time to put your questions in. We do have time for a few. I'd like to go back to something I think that you said initially. Well, actually, no. While we're on the state level priority slide, it seems like a good time to turn maybe to you first, Karl. You talked about going out and talking to folks and maybe campaigning for somebody at a state level. When you do that, particularly say if it's a new candidate, maybe a bit of an unknown, how do you choose a candidate and not risk upsetting maybe half of your membership?
Right. Well, one benefit that we have is we have a lot of members who do want to run for office. So if it's one of our own, that makes it a little bit easier. But we listen to the locals. They have all the say as far as our politics goes. So if I'm going to go out to Indiana and help there, I would check in with the local association and ask them, hey, I got this check in time. I want to come out and help. And then you got to. The important thing is just to be the absolute bottom of the rung helper. If that candidate needs knocking doors, making envelopes, organizing anything, just do all that work. And give you an example, in Indiana, actually, they have several home builder members who are in the state legislature, and that's created almost a builder caucus of its own. And that really got built because the builders decided to do all that grunt work and get their own elected. And then it becomes a lot easier for us to operate there. Yeah,
and I imagine easier, obviously, if you're actually canvassing for an actual member too, right? Yeah, of course. Josh, maybe a similar question to you. I know you're more concerned kind of at the federal level, and given that this is an election year, kind of what's different in terms of your advocacy and your lobbying this year?
Yeah, absolutely. We have, a lot of, immediate deadlines. The legislative calendar is certainly more conducive for in-district activities or things that are away from, Washington, D.C. So as much as you can get your members involved for, store visits, any of those in-person, hands-on sensory experiences that are outside of the Beltway are very important. I think that, looking at as we get closer to the conventions, having a convention strategy is important. We're going to be, as the association, having a presence at both conventions. It's important to note that it's not an endorsement of either candidate, but really a gathering to have a social event or a presence at each of those parties, marquee events of the year. So, a lot of members of Congress at the federal level, I'm trying to engage and create, consensus among people that support the premium cigar industry that include Democrats and Republicans. So having an event and presence at each of those venues is definitely something that is important for this year's strategy in particular.
Okay, great. A question from Megan, who is listening in. Any suggestions for education opportunities for those that came into this career later, including support functions such as writing briefs, tracking issues, learning about tools, etc.? Well, I think from the tools perspective, I can certainly answer that. We'd love to show you around some of our FiscalNote and CQ tools, Megan, if that's something of interest to you. But in terms of the writing briefs and support functions and tracking issues, maybe I'll go to Karl, seeing as he's right beside me in the studio here.
I think the Association for the ASAE, the Association Executives, they have a great, almost a graduate program, and also the State Government Affairs Council, SGAC. They have a series of classes you can take to kind of learn some of those functions, I guess. And then really just kind of being out there and learning as you go, I think. But those two groups stand on my head as really good spots to go and learn some of the, I don't want to say basics because it's not basic, but that's a good spot to start.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I would mention that we do on our website, both on cq.com, Megan, and also on fiscalnote.com, we have a resource center on each, and we have quite a few best practices, white papers and things like that there for you to download for free. So feel free, anyone listening, to download those as well. Josh, maybe you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think that there's an abundance of resources out there. I mean, of course, I would give a selfish plug for the Grassroots Professional Network. The variety of series that we put together on the different best practices. There's more to come with that. We're, doing a lot of new programming this year and getting ready to release it. I think with the election year, a lot of the professional networks are running about 1 or 2 weeks behind schedule on formalizing, what 2020 is going to look like. In terms of content programming, but there's several, professional associations and resources out there that provide a lot of information. I mentioned a few in the initial presentation, but on the written side of things, campaigns and elections, I would expect that we'll partner with FiscalNote on a few more white papers and surveys as the year progresses. So, there's a variety of different in-person as well as electronic resources available out there for consumption for GR and public affairs professionals.
Great. And Renee has also chimed in here, and she says that the U.S. Chamber also has some great training programs around grassroots best practices. So check those out too. Another question, what value do the panelists on the call today, so Karl and Josh, place on using third-party researchers for white papers and or providing testimony to House and Senate committees? Karl, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I think I place very high value on that. I work for the home builders, so we're a pretty selfish lobby as seen by members of the House and Senate or any state legislature. So if we can bring in an academic or something like that to kind of give some credence to our position, that goes a long ways. I would encourage you to find a third party or someone from maybe a different view where you can make a little bit of each side give a little bit and find some common ground and show that to the legislators. Give you an example, there's a ballot issue we're working in California that would hurt development, but also hurt the environment because of what could take its place. And so the Sierra Club and the home builders on the same page. We try not to say that out loud because it might disappear. It's such a weird thing, but it can happen. So I think having your coalition be that third party too is very helpful.
Yeah, and I know we've seen kind of anecdotally from other clients that sometimes putting unlikely partners together gives a greater impact. So that's kind of an interesting one. You did say it out loud.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Okay, so maybe time for one more question. I think this was at the end of your presentation, Josh. You said that you had a point about setting realistic expectations with the C-suite. And I know that we're now kind of talking about how the government relations space is sort of seeping into the business side of the house, and whether that's in a corporation or in maybe in your case, Karl and Josh, it's in membership and things like that. Things are tying closer together. So I just had a kind of a question about how do you realistically set the expectations of your higher ups in terms of what you can do and what you can't do?
So one of the unique things that I deployed this year was a federal strategy document. I worked with, and this is something that I started in November of 2019 with the expectation that it would be released in early February at our fly-in. We do an early fly-in, and for all of our board members, sought input from all of our outside consultants, internal staff in different departments, work with, our executive director as well as our association president, and got input on this 10 pages in totality that covers pretty much every basis of our overall government relations strategy. What issues are we going to focus on? What's our media relations angle? So it's a blueprint for 2020, and something that I wanted to have an affirmation from leadership, from our board of directors, so that they know what the expectations are. We do another meeting in July, and the meeting in July will be a benchmark that will address everything from that initial document. So, it's a lot of legwork. It's a lot of, getting people together to, coalesce around a set agenda and set ideas. But once that's created, a lot of it is just looking back on that. How do we make adjustments? All right, for instance, at the end of the year, you had the Tobacco 21 inclusion in the spending package. We had to adapt that. We removed that section, but explained, instead of, that as a specific bullet point, it was about implementation and how do we, inform our members of this policy change and engage with the FDA to provide information to our stakeholders. So, I think that setting expectation is a lot of engaging with all the people that's involved early on in the process and continually reverting back. I mean, it's not a constant. Like, I guarantee you that document that I presented in February is not going to be 100% accurate at the end of the year, based off of all of the variables and moving factors that we have to deal with. But again, it's a good blueprint and a good playbook. We just, as government relations professionals, have to be prepared to call an audible here and there as we're presented with new challenges.
Okay, great. Karl, anything to add there?
I think the only thing I would add is don't lie. That you learn that in kindergarten, hopefully. But if you tell your bosses, "Oh, sure, I can do that," in legislation, it's going to fail or pass for a lot of reasons that aren't us. And so I think it's important just to be honest and set that bar not low, but set it realistically. And if it's not going to work, I think it's okay to say no. That's not going to work. Let's find a different angle. That's I think appreciated higher up, because in like in an association we've got a paid CEO, but then we have a leadership team of men and women who are volunteers, and they really want their stuff done. And sometimes you have to say, well, that may not happen.
Yeah. So there we go. Words of wisdom from Karl. Don't lie. People vote to feel better, but not necessarily live better. And I think my favorite is that the average age of an electrician in the U.S. is now 54 years old.
That's right. Yes.
So with those pearls of wisdom, I think we'll wrap it up for today. Thanks again to Joshua Habursky from the Premium Cigar Association, to Karl Eckhart from the National Association of Home Builders, and from myself and Dermody. Thanks for joining us here at FiscalNote and CQ for our latest webinar. And keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending the recording to the presentation and also a link to the whole report shortly. So thanks, everyone.